Frank, this picture is a watershed.
I said, Frank, one day you'll run my studio.
I said, Frank, will you listen to that response? I said, Frank really knows what the public wants.
I said, Frank, this picture is a watershed.
Know what I'm having?
What?
Not much fun.
Party! Frank!
That Frank.
The guy is too much.
Hey, the party's outside.
That Frank.
Did you like the picture?
The platinum touch.
How about more champagne?
He has taste, he has talent.
Is he the best?
Plus a fine head for
The
business.
man is blessed.
You know, getting ready for this show, it occurred to me that two different Sondheim musicals have a kind of obsession with what becomes taste, what becomes good taste. You hear that, that's from Merrily We Roll Along, where, in fact, people are telling Frank to his face that he has terrific taste and his stuff is wonderful, and behind his back saying a very different thing. Similar comments and conversations go on in A Sunday in the Park with George. And I think for Sondheim, taste is kind of this tyranny of consensus, or kind of a toxic consensus. I think in Merrily We Roll Along, the group of people, the cognoscenti who are making these judgments, are referred to as the blob. And that is one way that taste can operate, right? I mean, we're going to talk today about the idea of taste, specifically good taste. Good taste, of course, implies bad taste. We have a White House possible renovation or addition project that might occasion a pretty spirited conversation of that, and probably will. We're going to talk today to Henry Oliver, who writes the literary Substack, The Common Reader, and is the author of Second Act, What Late Bloomers Can Tell You About Reinventing Your Life, and is part of the Emerging Scholars Program at the Mercatus Center. And Becca Rothfield is a nonfiction book critic and editor at The Point and a contributing editor at the Boston Review. She is the author of All Things Are Too Small, Essays in Praise of Excess. I will be interested to discuss with Becca where the first part of that title comes from, because it's kind of interesting all by itself. But I think we should begin with one of the great arbiters of good taste. That would be the drive-through bank teller from hell, Hannibal Lecter. Here's A1, please.
You're so ambitious, aren't you? Do you know what you look like to me with your good bag and your cheap shoes? You look like a rube. A well-scrubbed, hustling rube with a little taste. Good nutrition's giving you some length of bone, but you're not more than one generation from poor white trash.
That is, of course, Hannibal Lecter talking to Clarice Starling, Anthony Hopkins, and Jodie Foster, respectively. And so, Henry, there's a lot in there, actually. First of all, that idea of you're very ambitious is, I think, at times a certain kind of comment on taste. It's almost bad taste to be ambitious, particularly if you're trying to climb the rungs of the ladder. But he's also, he says you're a rube with a little taste. And the idea, I think, is that taste here is some kind of class determinant, right? It's a reinforcer of people's position in some kind of socioeconomic hierarchy, which, Henry, I think it's fair to say that is one of the ways that the idea of taste is used, right?
I actually disagree very strongly with that.
Good.
I'm English, so I live in a society that's full of very well-established class markers. And as far as I can tell, you can be really quite high up the social scale and be, as the great art historian Kenneth Clark said, as ignorant as a swan, and have no real taste for art or music or pictures or anything like that. And I think we live in a much more relaxed and egalitarian society now, but also a society that recognizes that you can enjoy Shakespeare and The Simpsons, for example, and that just because you see someone doing something that is quote unquote not in good taste, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not a person of good taste more broadly. So I think maybe that used to be true, but I don't really agree with it at all.
Becca Rothfeld, how about you? I see taste at times as a kind of eye of the needle through which many camels must try to pass, often unsuccessfully. I mean, I don't know. Just talk about what Henry just said or what I just said and agree or disagree.
I mean, I think that it's very fashionable these days, particularly in literary academia, to regard taste kind of as purely a reflection of class position. And I just don't think that that's true. And I think that a basic premise of the enterprise of literary criticism is the assumption that there are kind of objective facts of the matter about aesthetic quality, which is something that I've always believed. And that's a view that has a long tradition. Before my life as a literary critic, I was getting a PhD in philosophy for many years without completing it, but we talked a lot about this, and this is kind of a basic assumption of aesthetic philosophy in the philosophical parts of the academy as opposed to the literary scholarship parts. And that's always seemed to me to be a basic premise of kind of what we talk about and what we assume when we talk about art.
Yeah, I do want to point out that Immanuel Kant owned a huge collection of black velvet paintings of dogs playing poker. So he may have had sort of, some skin in the game that way. But no, I mean, Becca, Kant does sort of say that taste exists a priori, that you don't necessarily have to go through some acculturation process or fine-tuning of yourself, that somehow or other, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong about all this, but the taste exists and is maybe accessible to the human intellect.
I think that is Kant's view. I don't accept every part of that view, but I do accept the sort of starting premise that the kinds of arguments that we have about taste wouldn't make sense if we weren't assuming that there were an objective fact of the matter about it. It wouldn't make sense for me to be talking to my friends and say, no, you're wrong about this movie. Here are my reasons for believing the movie is good, if we weren't assuming in this conversation that there is kind of a truth to be discovered collectively about the movie's quality.
So, Henry, back to you, and I'm reading to you from your own work, and this is kind of a discussion of Ezra Klein talking about classical music or his approach to classical music, and he's discovered that he likes Philip Glass and Steve Reich and some of the minimalists, and you say Ezra Klein is reacting to the snobbery of good taste, which leads people to pretend to enjoy art for social reasons. Talking about good taste and bad taste often invokes such snobbery as if bad people have bad taste, and this is back to your point about the Simpsons and Shakespeare. This isn't true, of course. Reading Jilly Cooper or Colleen Hoover or Prince Harry doesn't mean that you are bad, but no one sensible can equate those books with the work of George Eliot. No one who has read a lot of literature and made it part of themselves would equate it. So say a little bit more about that. So somehow or other, there is a way. First of all, I mean, you're kind of acknowledging there that snobbery does play a part, at least in some of our discourse about taste, and that also that there are some kind of possibly Kantian standards that differentiate Middlemarch from whatever Prince Harry's autobiography.
Yes. So all I was saying about snobbery is snobs obviously exist, and they will use whatever it is they want to use to be snobs. And I'm saying, so what? That's not part of what we're discussing here, really. That's just snobs doing what they do. I agree very much with Becca. And my point about George Eliot was to say that even if you don't accept, you don't accept that there are so-called objective aesthetic truths, everyone in practice accepts that we behave as if there are, and we compare different works of art. And so when Becca says, you disagree about the movie and you give your reasons, people will very often get to the point of saying, okay, yes, I can see that was good, but I still don't like it. And I think that is the ultimate admission. And what people are then realizing is that there is a difference between preference and taste. So you can not enjoy something very much, but still come to a position of having seen the art, discussed the art, read about the art and gone, okay, do you know what? I can see that it is good. So a lot of people do not love the novel Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. It's a great novel. In my opinion, it's a very entertaining and readable novel. But a lot of people just find it boring. But they don't, if they're sensible, therefore, you go, oh, well, therefore it's bad. Because I don't like it, therefore it's bad. That's obviously just kind of stupid, right? Yeah. George Eliot is bad because you didn't enjoy her novel. Get real. So I think that the basis of criticism, I agree with Becca, but I'm not as much of a philosopher, so I take a more practical approach to the question and emphasize that what we're dealing with is a question of contrasts. If you have read enough literature, what you can do, and this is what Becca does in her articles very nicely, is to say exactly what the book is. Where does it fit with all the other books? What books is it like? What qualities does it have? How can we very accurately describe this book? Rather than just say, oh, I didn't like those characters, or those sentences didn't really do it for me. These are two very different things, right? And that's the difference between taste and just liking stuff and not liking stuff.
Yeah, I want to come back to that idea. We might not get back to it until the second segment, but I think what you're talking about is really important and interesting. So Becca Rothfeld, you use phrases like cultural Puritanism and I think dowdy Protestants from time to time. And the argument being, and I think it's a good one, that America has retained some of the prejudices of the first Europeans to come here. And they were, like today's Anabaptists, very concerned with plainness. And they connected beauty. They connected opulent beauty or any kind of gaudiness to, I think, their feelings about Rome and Catholicism, which they regarded as the whore of Babylon. So maybe say a little bit about that. To what degree does that continue to dictate some of our ideas about taste?
I think to a greater degree than most people want to acknowledge. I mean, I think that there's kind of just a great suspicion of aesthetic pursuits and a broad assumption that they're frivolous. And I think this also extends just to the enterprise of fiction. I was just reviewing a book of critical essays by the novelist Henry James, where he makes this claim also. He says that a kind of fundamental assumption of Anglophone novels is that there's something suspect about fiction. There's something intrinsically deceptive about fiction. There's something kind of morally bad about concerning yourself with made-up stories. And I believe that this is why autobiographical fiction or fiction that's actually kind of truthful in a way has become so predominant in the Anglophone literary sphere. So I think that really persists, and I think that that's to the detriment of our aesthetic culture.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think, Henry, a bit about some of the American figures kind of around the early part of the 20th century. I mean, I think from 1880 to 1935 or so, there's this feeling that sort of aesthetic position is a little bit jeopardized, that the middle class is starting to have disposable income. They can become orchid hobbyists and things like that, and new sources of wealth are coming in. And with that, either new aesthetic standards or attempts to imitate existing aesthetic standards unsuccessfully. So you do have Gatsby. I think Gatsby's more established but economic peers think he has bad taste. He's excessive. He has, to use Becca's formulation, Charles Foster Kane to a certain degree too. Xanadu, his San Simeon, is vulgar. Maybe say a little bit about that. I think from a certain point of view, maybe from Nick Carraway's ultimate point of view, Gatsby's a somewhat more genuine figure from some of the people who feel free to look down their noses at him.
I suppose so. I don't think we're really supposed to approve of Gatsby, or that the novel is saying buy a nice silk shirt.
Yeah.
Well, not at all even. But I think Becca's point is well made, and it's interesting that people like Henry James and T.S. Eliot have to come to England to be properly aesthetic. You have to leave America. And when Robert Frost was the same at the same time, and Frost was very clear. He said, "I simply can't write poetry in this country. It's not possible. It's just not possible." And a lot of what you think of as the great American poems of Robert Frost were written in a little village outside of London, where it is much less Puritan. So I think there is something in that, and I agree with you that there's a great extravagance in modernism, a great aesthetic extravagance. But again, it's very European. Virginia Woolf might be the most beautiful writer of all the modernists, and she's a very, very English writer. I mean, really steeped in the old tradition of English prose. So I think those are probably the main points. And I would also say that re-engagement with the canon is crucial to that, which James and Eliot and Woolf and everyone has.
Right. Well, I want to bring up all of this stuff in the second segment. I have a whole lot of thoughts about the canon that I want to bring up. But since we're talking, Becca, about Gatsby, we could talk here a little about the role of critics, particularly as gatekeepers. Well, I mean, Gatsby, as we know, was not a critical success when it was published. And I mean, really, you could say that about it. Whenever we're doing an episode here about some canonical work, I mean, 50% of the time, it turns out to have been a critical flop when it's first introduced. Moby Dick couldn't even be read. I mean, in Melville's lifetime, very few people actually read Moby Dick. So what does that tell us about the critics as gatekeepers for taste?
I don't really think of critics as gatekeepers for taste. I think of them primarily as popularizers. I mean, I think that the job of a critic is to make the canon and make literature that might otherwise seem unapproachable and inaccessible seem inviting to the general public. That's what I think that my role is. And I think of myself as a democratizer in a way, like a kind of fundamental thing that I assume when I write a book review is that everybody can appreciate a book. Everybody is capable of good taste. And if that weren't true, I wouldn't write for a general audience. One of the reasons I left academia is because I feel like that there's such a specialized, small audience, and I think a broader public is capable of aesthetic appreciation. So while critics might be gatekeepers for novelists or for authors, I don't think that they're gatekeepers when they approach the public for whom they're writing. I think that that's kind of an important distinction to make. Is that even if there's a hierarchy of works of art, that doesn't imply that there's a hierarchy of appreciators. It might still be the case that everybody is equally capable of aesthetic appreciation.
Yeah, Henry, as I was reading for today's show, I stumbled across this interesting exchange. It's from 1943. The New York Times has reviewed an exhibition that includes the work of Adolf Gottlieb and Mark Rothko, and the criticism has been somewhat negative. And so what the Times did, Edward Alden Jewell specifically did, was to invite Rothko and Gottlieb to respond in print to the befuddlement that one of the critics had expressed toward their work. And what they wrote was interesting. They said, "We refuse to defend them, not because we cannot. No possible set of notes can explain our paintings. Their explanation must come out of a consummated experience between picture and onlooker." And that's getting kind of close to what Becca's saying there, too, that the ultimate exchange is between the creator and the consumer of the creation, and I guess I guess I'm asking where the notion of taste then fits into that.
I think what taste can do for you is all the examples you gave of these books that get badly reviewed, or these artists and no one understands them when they first come out. That's because art is constantly trying to do something new, and when it does something new, people read it or look at it and go, "I don't really know what I'm looking at anymore." And Wordsworth said this. He said, every great artist has to make his own audience, right? And Proust said it again. If you're going to do really great art, it's going to be so new that the audience is going to say, "I don't really know what I just read." So at that point, what you would do naturally is ask the person you went to the gallery with, or ask your friend who read the book, what is going on here? What am I looking at? And you would talk about it. And your friend might have noticed something that you didn't notice, or your friend might say, "Oh, well, actually, I read another book a bit like this, and that helps me understand it," things like that. What criticism is doing is like being your friend whenever you need it, but your friend who is really, really well informed and does actually know what's going on and can tell you, "Well, look at it like this, understand these points. Did you see the sort of language they were using?" and so forth. And so that is the role of taste, and taste essentially is knowledge. It's not just personal reaction. It's a personal reaction that you can then base in knowledge. So if you're a chef, you can pick up food, ingredients, vegetables, all these things. You know if they're fresh. You know how they're going to taste. You know how they can be combined. You have all that knowledge, which gives you literal taste, right? Actual, you can put it in your mouth and taste it, which is very different from the rest of us who just eat the food and go, "Oh, it's good, yeah." So that's the role of criticism, is to bring knowledge into the picture.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Becca, go ahead.
Sorry, can I just jump in very quickly? I think people have a conception that criticism is only done by professional critics. And I think that something that Henry says that's very important is that that's not true. Everybody who is engaging thoughtfully with the work of art, as opposed to just having kind of an instinctive reaction of like or dislike, is engaging in criticism. And you can see people on Letterboxd arguing about movies, they're engaging in criticism. People on Goodreads arguing about the quality of books are engaging in criticism. So I think that it's easier to think of critics as gatekeepers when you think of critics as limited to professional book reviewers, but I don't think that that's the right way to think about criticism.
Yeah, so let me bring this. I was going to save this for the second segment, but it fits right here. So let's talk about it. So I don't know why I'm stuck in modernism today, but so 1913, Stravinsky's Rites of Spring debuts in Paris, and meanwhile Schoenberg and Berg and some of these other composers have this so-called Skandal concert in Vienna. And what happens is that all of these people who are going to see this work, they are knowledgeable about the music that has preceded this work. They are knowledgeable about the canon, and their response is to go bat poop crazy and have what is sometimes described as riots. And you're turning to your friend to say, well, what did you think of that? And your friend says, I want to throw some stuff up on stage. That's what I think. And so, Henry, I'm wondering whether knowledge, in certain canonical knowledge, begins to preclude an engagement with something new and different.
It can do. This is more a question of individual temperaments and personality, because a lot of us reach a certain age when we're no longer very open to new knowledge. And a lot of people acquire knowledge, but they're not actually very open they don't have a high openness in their personality to begin with. And it is often the case that the members of the avant-garde are very high in openness, are very keen to learn new things. And then when they hit middle age, and the new generation comes along and the new avant-garde comes along, they turn around and say, oh, my dear, this is dreadful. We would never do it like this. So that's just basic human life. That's just middle age. Not everyone is going to maintain that kind of openness throughout their life. But the practice of criticism, whoever is undertaking it, when it is done well, does always maintain that and uses the knowledge appropriately rather than as a beating stick to say, my grandmother wouldn't have thought much of this or whatever.
Yeah, well, I mean, Becca, I want you to respond to this in general, but I'll just sharpen it a little bit and say that I'm a member of the baby boom generation. We grew up liking the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Motown music, and for the most part, our parents found this shocking and abrasive, and it grated on their eardrums, and it didn't sound like music. And then most of my peers turned into those people when hip-hop came along and the baby boomers were 60 and they started saying, that's not music. And I do feel as though there's, if taste is stable or platonic in any particular way, it still doesn't do very well with changing aesthetics, with new ideas. But just react to all of this, Becca.
So I think that the claim that taste is platonic or that there are facts of the matter about art that is good or bad doesn't imply that we're always correct about what's good or bad. Those are two separate things. And I think that you can think of this on analogy with morality. I think it's maybe more intuitive in the moral realm, at least for somebody trained in philosophy. We think that there is a truth about what's right or wrong, but we still argue about it because we don't have perfect access to it. And that's why we engage in these arguments. That's why we engage in conversations. But we're undertaking a process of discovery. We want to discover what the truth is. That's kind of an assumption of the way that those conversations go down. And sort of in defense, I guess, of taste, I would say that taste is ultimately a corrective. People might make the wrong judgments of things like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or hip hop or Stravinsky originally. But over the course of conversations, over the course of engaging in further aesthetic conversation and debate, people do ultimately come to what I regard as the correct assessments. Although, of course, I can never know that with certainty, too, from my partial human position.
All right. This is a good place for us to pause, but that's all we're going to do is pause. We're going to come back. We have a lot more to say about all of this. Stay with us.
I'm gonna take 6 and try to turn him to a 10. Don't you take it as a compliment if I invite you up to my place. And you should go and seek therapy if you make it past one day. 'Cause baby, I got bad taste.
You knock back the schnapps, you talk back to cops, you walk in the room and conversation stops. I can't take it nowhere. No, I can't take it nowhere. You stagger, you sag, you're half in the bag. One glass of beer and you're a total drag. I can't take it nowhere. No, I can't take it nowhere. I buy 3 or 4, you mooch plenty more. The check comes around and you are out the door. I can't take you nowhere. No, I can't take you nowhere.
Okay, so we are talking about taste, good and bad, but I mean, mostly about good. But I think we have to talk about bad, too. We're talking to Henry Oliver, who writes the literary substack, The Common Reader, and is the author of Second Act, What Late Bloomers Can Tell You About Reinventing Your Life, part of the Emerging Scholars Program at the Mercatus Center. Becca Rothfeld is the nonfiction book critic and an editor at The Point and a contributing editor at the Boston Review. She's the author of All Things Are Too Small, Essays in Praise of Excess. think we need to talk about excess. First of all, I did promise, Becca, that we'd just talk briefly about the person from whom you have taken the title, who is a medieval religious person from, I believe, a lay order at the time, and I'm not even sure how to pronounce her name, but I'm sure that you do know how to pronounce her name. So tell us a little bit about this writer and why you picked those words.
I don't actually know how to pronounce her name, which I discovered when I went to a book festival in the Netherlands, and they were saying something that I just absolutely cannot make my mouth do. I had been pronouncing it Hedevich of Brabant. I think that possibly a Dutch person would just not even understand what I was saying. But the title of the book comes from a poem that she wrote about how all things are too small is the name of the poem and the first line of the poem. And she goes on to say, all things are too small to hold me, because sort of her passion for divinity exceeds all earthly containers. And I thought that was a good line to encapsulate some of the energy that I wanted my book to capture as well.
Yeah, I was amused to discover that she was a member of a lay order. I mean, maybe even a sort of an official or something, a leader in a lay order.
The Beguines, another word that I don't know how to pronounce.
Oh, well, I'm saying it's Beguines. I'm assuming one of their prayers is, what moments divine, what rapture serene, till clouds came along to disperse the joys we had tasted. I love the idea that there's an order called the Beguines. But so let's talk a little bit about excess. I want both of you to do that. Henry, let me just bring you in. This may actually be a cultural reference point that means nothing to you, but in the second or third Rocky movie, he's got some money, and so he buys a big house, and it's got lots of marble, and it's really pretty clearly vulgar. I don't know who gets to decide that it's vulgar, but I remember sitting there in the movie theater going, "Oh no, that's what you did with the money." I mean, I don't know. When Roman emperors used marble, it was maybe okay. Okay, but it's not cool for your house in New Jersey. There is something about excess that we distrust, Henry. I mean, we may feel that if music is the food of love, give me excess of it. But excess, it kind of has a bad rap. I'd love your thoughts.
I think we mistrust excess, such as in the example you gave with the vulgar house, when it is applied in the wrong proportions. So an emperor can use a lot of marble in a way that suits the proportions not only of the building, but of the building's function and symbolic purpose, and of the emperor's status, himself. Whereas if you're just, ordinary person like all of us, building yourself a mini temple, then you have violated some sort of aesthetic set of proportions, because this is not how things work. And that's a very, very old idea. But excess in general, I don't think we're scathing of. And I think a lot of people walk around these days with an excess of color and decoration in their personal appearance, or they have a home that is very, very highly or excessively decorated, and there's a great lot of value in that, right?
Yeah, what
is in bad taste is the misuse of aesthetic forms.
Yeah, Cyndi Lauper had excess. Her self-presentation was very excessive. Becca, I've tried to steer away from this, but I think there's no avoiding this conversation. This is all happening as we're finding out that President Trump, who, I think many of us feel, Spy magazine famously dubbed him the short-fingered vulgarian. Many of us feel that vulgarian part is very true, which is fine if he does it at Mar-a-Lago or the Trump Tower. He's talking about changing the White House or adding on to the White House. He wants to build a ballroom, which in one of the mock-ups looked like it was maybe the size of the rest of the White House. He doesn't do anything except to excess. And I'm finding my Protestant, my wayward Puritan self being really troubled by this idea in a way that I'm not troubled by he can do what he wants with his own stuff. This is our stuff. But I'd love your thoughts.
Well, first, I disagree that he can do what he wants with his own stuff. I think that ugliness anywhere is an assault against humanity everywhere, whether it be sequestered in Mar-a-Lago or not. But what I would say is that it's not his maximalism that's to blame. It's just the quality of the things that he wants to construct. There's tasteless maximalism and there's tasteful maximalism, just like there's tasteless minimalism and there's tasteful minimalism. Moby Dick is one of the most excessive books ever written. Infinite Jest, which is a book that many would not defend, but that I would defend to the grave. And those are both enormously excessive books. They're encyclopedic. They're in excellent taste, precisely because they're so excessive. Or The Anatomy of Melancholy, which is this absolutely insane classic work on melancholy. These are all great books and widely acknowledged to be great books. So the problem is not just the size of what Trump's doing, but the quality of it. And I think you would have to engage in kind of more detailed criticism than I'm prepared to do right now to explain precisely why Mar-a-Lago or paving over the Rose Garden is so offensive to people of good taste and good conscience. But it can be done.
Absolutely. I mean, the word that comes up here, Henry, it was one that you have dealt with, is Philistinism. And then the question is, my Philistinism is maybe my own business. Becca might disagree. Maybe say just a little bit more about that, and then we'll move on.
I think it matters not at all if someone is a Philistine. The world is full of them, and it always has been, and we get on just fine. What does matter is when people in the establishment, in the cultural establishment, are Philistines. So there are many people today in the literary establishment, in the reviews and the journals and the newspapers and the publishing houses. And I'm not going to name anyone or anything because I'm already being offensive enough to various people. But they have very bad taste in the sense that I described earlier, which is that they do not know enough to support the judgments they make, and the judgments they make are often very unsound. So that kind of Philistinism is clearly a serious problem. And I think that's where gatekeeping becomes relevant. I agreed with what Becca said earlier, but there is a kind of gatekeeping in the institutional sense. And if the people doing that are Philistines, then you can expect bad results to follow, right?
Yeah. I just quickly want to just talk about what happens when you break with what seems to be a consensus about taste. And Becca, I'm specifically going to ask you about what happened when you disparaged the work of Sally Rooney, who I feel like for your people in your own life, Sally Rooney would be kind of a go-to thing. I have to say, I did not finish Normal People about 3/4 of the way through. I thought, I've got some sunk cost. I've read 3/4 of this book. I also don't really care what happens to these people. So I think I maybe understand this. But did you feel like you were out on a limb saying, doing a little diss track about Sally Rooney?
I've repeatedly experienced great anxiety before a review of mine comes out that is a takedown of something that lots of people like. At this point, it's no longer just Sally Rooney. I've written negative reviews of Leslie Jameson or Salman Rushdie's memoir about getting stabbed. I'm always afraid. And in fact, it always turns out that there is a large silent majority that comes out of the woodwork to agree with the aesthetic assessment. And so I've actually never really come in for a ton of mean comments or anything. I mean, I do get the stray, insane email from somebody who's mad at me for believing that women should have jobs and things like that. But it's never because I've just negatively reviewed a book that lots of people like. People always seem to be grateful for that, actually.
See, this means Sondheim was right, that there is just this blob of people who, rather than actually sharing their own opinions, are waiting around to see what the consensus is and then hiding whatever their feelings are about Sally Rooney or anything else. Hey, we just got a small amount of time left, and I think both of you should talk a little bit about whether it's possible to develop one's taste, to, at the end of a year or 2 years or 5 years, have better taste than one did at the outset. Henry, why don't you start?
Oh, of course it's possible. All you have to do is read, watch, look, listen a lot more and be attentive and learn about what it is you're looking at, the way a chef would learn about the ingredients and the recipes and the technique and so on. And you have to remember, this is very important, that if you do not currently have good taste, then you don't know which critics to trust. And you don't know which members of the critical establishment are Philistines parading themselves or are people whose opinions you should take seriously. So as you're going on this development, you should pay attention to who do I want to listen to as well, and not just take their opinion for granted.
I think also, there's something to be said for critics who really challenge your own assessment. I remember reading Leon Wieseltier's review of Schindler's List and thinking, wow, that is not what I thought about this movie at all, but that's really, really interesting that he's saying that. And I want to think about it. But I think people often reflexively say, oh, no, that's not what I think.
Exactly. No, you should take everyone as an opportunity to learn something, not as an opportunity to agree or disagree, as it were.
Yeah, Becca, chime in. How about you? Is taste a muscle? Can you exercise it and make it better?
Well, first, I would say that you should trust me. I'm a critic who's not a Philistine. That's where you can start.
I agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think that optimism about the possibility of inducing people to cultivate good taste is at the core of the critical endeavor. There wouldn't be any point in writing book reviews that make arguments about whether books are good or bad every week unless you thought that people could read them and could change their tastes on their basis. And everybody who ends up with good taste, if one believes that good taste is not innate but is the product of education, then everybody who ends up with good taste has arrived there by doing due diligence. And so it's possible for anybody at any stage in their life to read widely, to watch lots of films, to go look at visual art, and to think carefully about what's working and what isn't, to have conversations about it and to read about it. And that's the only secret that there is.
So I got about 90 seconds left, and this is a much longer conversation. And I want to both say it's been so much fun having both of you on here. You really have kept me on my toes. You're both so interesting and so smart. And, Henry, if one sign that taste might be sort of a feedback loop of some type would be the experiment that you did with AI. Can you just quickly tell us about your AI experiment?
Someone created an AI that assesses poetry, and I stuck in some very famous poems to see if it really knew the difference between Emily Dickinson and, someone else. And it did very well. And then I gave it AI poems, and it was going crazy, saying these were even better than Emily Dickinson. And what I started to think was maybe AI is going to have a slightly different taste to humans. The AI does understand that Emily Dickinson is, the best of the best, but actually the preferences are going to be so different that they will have taste in AI-generated poetry that most humans with good taste wouldn't share.
Becca, explain the chortle that I heard.
That's ridiculous. AI poetry is not better than Emily Dickinson. But my more serious thought is that this view that AI is going to have different tastes than people do is consistent with the Kantian picture. Kant's view is that human taste is a product of the way that our faculties are constituted. And so it would make sense that AI's faculties are constituted differently and it would have different taste.
Yeah, I think it also is a sign of a feedback loop. Hey, I like that. It's like me. It's like what I would do. All right, well, we have to stop there. Henry Oliver writes the literary Substack, The Common Reader. Becca Rothfeld is her book, All Things Are Too Small, Essays in Praise of Excess, is very much about what we've been talking about. We have to say goodbye to them, but not to you. We'll take a little break and we'll come back.
With a friend or two, I used to read him by myself. But just to read him now only makes me blue. So I tossed him from my shelf. I'll read Don Quixote 5 or 6 times through. I'll read Jackie Collins till my face turns blue. Hell, I'll even read Bukowski too. But I'll never read Trollope again. No, I'll never read Trollope again.
And it's time to say some thank yous. We're going to start with the man turning the knobs and pulling the levers. I'm not really sure what goes on in control rooms because I never get to be in there. But Eugene Amatruda, the Jedi Master's in there right now. He is assisted from afar. He is remotely assisted by the maestro, Dylan Reyes. This is a Lily Tyson Quality Entertainment Productions production. So thanks to Lily Tyson as well. I think I've thanked everybody, but let me know on Slack if I left anybody out. We're going to talk about the other kind of taste, like whether things taste good or not. And we're going to do that with Nick Sharma, a molecular biologist turned 2-time James Beard finalist, best-selling cookbook author, photographer, columnist, and editor at America's Test Kitchen. He really needs to get a lot busier. His cookbooks include The Flavor Equation, The Science of Great Cooking, explained in more than 100 essential recipes. Nick Sharma, I don't know if this is a cultural touch point for you or not, but as I was thinking about this segment, I was thinking about there's a scene in the movie Big where the Tom Hanks character, who looks like an adult but is 12 or 13 or whatever year old boy, goes to an adult party, and I think he eats caviar or something. And whatever it is, he does what a kid would do. He's in an adult body. He's literally trying to scrape it off of his tongue. He's trying to get rid of it any way that he possibly can, short of swallowing it. And it is such a great moment of, when we're younger, when we're children, we're I think, probably less open to different kinds of taste experiences. And when we're having a bad one, the reaction is almost reflexive, involuntary, and visceral. I mean, we know what we don't like when we're that age. I don't know. Say a little bit about how you perceive that, about how we either decide what we like the taste of and maybe how it changes.
Absolutely. I think that's the perfect example, caviar and people freaking out about the texture. Now, I love caviar, but I know my mom, who grew up with eating a lot of seafood from a young age, hates the texture. And it's just something that she hasn't overcome. So I think a lot of these things do depend on when we're exposed to them in our life, whether we had a good experience with it or a bad experience, and then also overcoming aversions if that's possible. Maybe later on as an adult, you'll have it in a fantastic way and it changes the whole perception for you. So there is a lot of wiggle room when it comes to taste and appreciating or hating them.
Talk a little bit about what you call the flavor equation. Explain what that is.
So when I was in grad school, one of the research studies that I was involved on was salt. I was studying low salt diets in humans and in animals. And the most fascinating thing about salt is that our taste of salt comes from sodium. Sodium is present in sodium chloride, which is table salt. And you cannot completely deplete it from your diet. You'll still try to find some way to get it. And if you don't, your bones are the biggest reservoir for salt in your body. And your bones start dissolving, which leads to osteoporosis. So you start getting that salt in your blood. So there are all these things that, started to make me excited when I was in grad school to learn more about taste. And the one thing I learned that taste is just not about something that's happening in your mouth. It's also what you smell, which is another huge component. In fact, the entire experience is at about 80%. 80% of taste of flavor is aroma. And then the other things that are in there include sight, what you see, what you feel in your hands, but even in your mouth. The texture of food is so important. And then we've got emotions and memories. These are all these different things that are playing into what we are perceiving as flavor in one dimension, but it's so much more. And that's what I refer to as the flavor equation.
It makes me think of my partner and I were in Paris eating at a restaurant that we really liked there. I think it was called the Buisson Ardent. It's kind of an obscure restaurant, but but the food's really great. And there was a guy sitting next to us one night, and he was eating by himself. And one got the sense right away that he was either a chef or a food critic or something. But what he did at the beginning was very interesting. He just kind of hung his head over the plate, and then he would sort of very, very gently, with his palms flat, kind of guide the smell up towards his face. He hadn't even picked up his fork yet. And I think about that, and I think about what you're saying, because I think our idea of how to taste something is to pick up your fork right away and jam it into your mouth. And I'm now wondering whether we're kind of cutting to the chase a little bit ahead of everything else that you just talked about.
Oh, totally. When you're a child, your parents usually tell you, eat slowly, kind of take the time to appreciate your food. It's all about this, right? And when you're talking about this critic in France, pulling up those aromas to their nose, I think that's such a beautiful thing, because you take a moment there to actually appreciate the food that's in front of you in terms of flavor, but in a multidimensional component. So you're just taking a moment to appreciate. And I think that's what flavor at the end of the day is for all of us. We just need to take a little moment to see how it looks, how it feels, how it smells. Think about the work that went into it. You start to appreciate something very simple in a much more glorious way.
We've seemed to have gone through sort of a flavor and taste revolution with just a lot of things added in. You're quoted in a New York Times article, I think it was the New York Times, where the writer writes at one point, at Starbucks, I noticed an iced lavender cream oat milk matcha had returned to the menu for spring, along with a new iced cherry chai. I can't even create any kind of mental picture in my mind of what the taste of an iced lavender cream oat milk matcha, but there's suddenly a lot of new terms to use. Matcha is maybe not even a word that I'm a baby boomer. So talk a little bit about that. There's a shock of the new, just like Stravinsky's Rite of Spring freaked people out when they heard it and saw the ballet in Paris in 1913. People have a little bit of a shock sometimes with just all this stuff that they've never heard of.
Oh, absolutely. I think where this comes from is actually recipe writing. So I started my career in recipe writing, and for the longest time, it still is difficult for us to include all the ingredients that we think as writers make the recipe unique. And so the tendency then is to list all those special ingredients on top in the recipe title, which is exactly what is happening here. But as a reader, it is overwhelming. It's too much information and you can't really make sense of it. This is something that I've seen that's predominantly done in the West. However, if you go to the East, like I grew up in India, and you see a lot of these ingredients not being mentioned in the title, the dish usually just has a small, short name and people go with it. And one of the misconceptions that happens when you write a recipe title or like this matcha latte with all those ingredients I can't even remember that you just mentioned, it's problematic because your brain then starts to think of, oh, I want to taste matcha, I want to taste vanilla, I want to taste cardamom, whatever other things were in there, I can't remember. But your brain wants you to taste all those individual components. If you don't taste those individual components, you're disappointed because you didn't have that experience that the name was trying to sell you. So in that sense, it can be a disservice, which is why I do think we need to be a little bit more creative with names, make them shorter and not try to sell individual experiences when the food is actually it's a combined experience of these ingredients. And spice blends are the perfect example because you see these in Asia. I'll give you an example, like you've got Chinese five spice. No one actually goes in there and says, oh, let's talk about the star anise or the cinnamon and all those other things. We just say Chinese five spice and you kind of know what you're getting. I think that's something we need to really seriously think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm guilty of that. I go to Penzies and I buy a lot of those blends. And then if the recipe calls for cumin, I just look for a blend that has cumin in it. And I know that's not exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. One thing really quickly here, we should first of all say that there's some things some taste people don't like, and they have every right to not like it because they have a biochemical aversion to it. The people who don't like cilantro or it tastes metallic or like soap or something, that's genetic. There's nothing they can do about that. And I think the thing about your asparagus and your pea is that everybody's pea smells bad, but only some people can smell how bad it smells. But so there are things like that. But what I wanted to quickly ask you about, we're kind of running out of time, and I apologize, is, I live in New England. The growing season is short. I do all the cooking in my house, and I'm waiting right now for the other person who consumes this food to say, please don't put sweet corn in anything else, because there's been sweet corn in everything we've had for nights and nights and nights because the season's short. And so I strip it off the cob and I cook with it. You just did a savory olive and sweet corn loaf. Maybe talk a little bit about that idea of experimenting with something, seeing how many different ways you can use it before you max it out.
That's a tough question. When I lived on the East Coast, the CSA boxes drove me nuts when they send lettuce every week. So I get where you're coming from. There's only so much you can do. But I do think one of the things I do is if I'm familiar with an ingredient, let's say sweet corn, since you've just mentioned that, I look for it out of context in the culture or in the narrative that I've always known about it. So for me, sweet corn is something that I would grow up either grilled or tossed into salads, maybe put in potato pancakes sometimes. That's about it. So I'll try to see what do people in other parts of the world, how do they use this? And often there are really cool ideas that they're just new to me. So I'll bring them in, try out those recipes. If I love them, I'll start incorporating them. And that's a really fun way to also learn about another culture and get an experience for how they're doing things different.
Yeah, is shizuka the thing that has the egg in it? You put the egg in
it?
Yeah. I made a shizuka with sweet corn about 3 or 4 nights ago. I don't know. The response was kind of quiet, so maybe I'm shizuka. Yeah, well, I don't know. You're a delight to talk to. I hope we can have you back for a longer conversation. Nick Sharma, molecular biologist turned 2-time James Beard finalist, best-selling cookbook author. Check out The Flavor Equation, the science of great cooking, explained in more than 100 essential recipes. And you folks are essential. We wouldn't do the show if you weren't listening. Thanks for listening today. Thanks to everyone who helped. We'll be back tomorrow with more.